Hello and welcome to Season 7, Episode 7 of Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. My name's Hugh Lemmy, I'm a writer and author.
And I'm Ben Miller, a writer, researcher, and member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin.
So last week we talked about John Whitgift, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who feathered his own nest while also persecuting his Puritan rivals in the Elizabethan Church of England. Who are we talking about this week, Ben?
Well, this week's story has everything. It has fast cars, vast quantities of jewelry, casinos, the dazzling nightlife of 1920s France, and lesbian swindlers.
Sounds like a Bond film.
So I think a good place to start is with the December 5th, 1928 issue of The Guardian, which carried the following headline. And the story here was so important, considered so important to The Guardian's readers, that The Guardian had actually sent its own correspondent to France to cover the story. Swindling charges in Paris, it read. Woman and her former husband arrested. Political interest. So in the early hours of the morning, after an all-night watch had been kept on their houses, the police had arrested Madame Marthe Hanau, the proprietress of the Gazette du Franc et des Nations, and her business associate and former husband, Monsieur Lazare Bloch.
Okay.
Now, this was a stunning downfall for a woman who had once driven from her chic Paris address to her seaside villa dripped in jewels. This was a woman who had built a several hundred million franc financial powerhouse, and she used her newspaper, Le Gazette du Franc et des Nations, to promote her get-rich schemes. And she often advertised these schemes with photographs of world leaders, including U.S. President Calvin Coolidge and even Mussolini.
Wow, okay.
Her investors were promised returns of 8% interest on savings, and in investments, 40% a year. Sounds great, right?
And especially in the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the start of the Great Depression.
Well, before. This is
before.
Yeah.
Okay.
But by the time that she died in prison, her investors were owed 155 million francs.
Whew.
Some people actually credit her spectacular swindle with contributing to the political confluence that brought Léon Blum and his Popular Front to power in France at the end of the 1930s. And she managed to do all of this at a time when in France, women did not even have the vote.
Wow.
Perhaps lost a bit to the historical record due to the spectacular billions in swindling of Alexandre Stavisky. That story broke just after hers and actually brought down the French government in a spectacular orgy of far-right political violence. Her story is the fascinating tale of just how far one woman was able to go to accumulate wealth and power by any means necessary, despite her religion and ethnicity and her gender. So she was doing all of this in a French Third Republic, which the historian Paul Jankowski describes as, quote, founded via media after a rapid exhaustion of alternatives, end quote. The Third Republic, he said, quote, had from the start the task of reconciling a parliamentary process relying on compromise with a popular legitimacy all too often excluding it. The chamber acquired a reputation for easy virtue in a republic identified with the genuine article, end quote. Sound familiar? So the Third Republic is born from the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. France loses Alsace and Lorraine. Difficult conditions are imposed on France, and this leads to a whole bunch of social unrest, including the famous Paris Commune.
Right.
And the Third Republic is founded in 1875. They keep having some conversations about reestablishing the monarchy or having some kind of presidential system, but no one can agree. Mm-hmm. And so the Third Republic was supposed to be a provisional government, and it just becomes the real government because no one can figure out what else to do. But it would be a mistake to describe the Third Republic as some kind of stagnant backwater. This is the time when France establishes much of its vast colonial empire.
Yeah.
But there is in metropolitan France sort of some kind of democratic political culture. There are many transfers of power back and forth between different groups. And domestically, there's sort of tension between traditionalist France embodied in the church and rural life and reformist France, which, of course, since the 1789 revolution has been an ongoing theme. Mm-hmm. And remember, the 1789 revolution, when the Third Republic is formed, is less than 100 years old. Right. So we're less than 100 years out of absolute monarchy, 2 generations. So the Third Republic goes from 1875 to 1940, and Hanau's dates are 1890 to 1935. So it's extremely similar lifespans.
Yeah.
So the obstacles that were present to Marthe Hanau in her life are perhaps best summed up by the way that she was described in the New Yorker magazine when a 1939 article about the scandal written by Janet Flanner was published. And this article remains one of the few detailed and credible English language sources on her life. And the article is entitled The Swindling Présidente, with an E at the end of president. Hanau's mother was, Flanner wrote, quote, a patient, penny-pinching Jewess, end quote.
Wow.
Now, we don't have to assign any disproportionate malice or prejudice to Flanner or to read too much onto the anachronistic and to, I think, our ears deeply uncomfortable use of the word Jewess, which I think sounds a lot worse to us than it would have then.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the stereotypes at play are extremely clear.
Yeah.
And so the article depicts her mother as this tight-fisted Jew who unexpectedly gave her daughter this giant dowry in 1908 when she married Lazare Bloch. Clues as to why her mother was so enthusiastic come from other sources. She apparently had a youthful habit of dating other women, including a musician, and at one point, one of the women who worked in her mother's shop, who, of course, got fired as soon as the affair.
Wait, this was Hanau or her mother?
Hanau dated a woman who worked in her mother's shop. Because that's where you're going to go to have your secret lesbian affairs, your mom's employees. And she was always an extremely good student, especially in maths at school. Wouldn't know what that's like. And she originally planned to teach maths, but then she met Bloch and she agreed to marry him. He was the son of a jute businessman in Lille. And apparently she made him agree when they got married that they would not have to have children.
Okay.
So in 1912, the two put the dowry to...
Reminds me of the Dryburgh.
I'm not sure. We can talk about it. I think it's interesting. There's it's difficult to tell with her.
But when he goes to the the hotel after their wedding on their first night of their honeymoon, and she tries to stay in the same bed as him. She's like slipped money to the receptionist, and then he says like she broke the marriage vows. She tried to sleep with me. Right.
I'm not sure in this case. It's difficult. I think we'll talk about Marthe Hanau, but I think bisexual is probably a decent place to slot her. So, in 1912, the couple decided to open a perfume shop with an attached factory, and they started making and marketing a scent that Hanau had created, which was called Garden of Murcia. But when the First World War began, suddenly it was a little harder to sell perfume. And so the couple decided to sell the business and instead to make and sell a rum and coffee mixture, which was called La Tube du Soldat. So it was a rum coffee mix advertised as something soldiers could quickly consume for a boost of energy and to blow off steam in the trenches.
Sounds amazing. I love a little something in my coffee.
But here's the problem. The rum coffee drink Tube de Soldat contained no coffee and no rum.
Like one of these sort of, fantasy Eclipse sort of inventions, probably all cocaine.
I mean, who knows what it was. But whatever it was false advertising. And so the marketing authorities discovered this. Bloch was arrested for misrepresentation of merchandise. He was very briefly jailed. They lost all their money. And the pair actually divorced. However, they remained on friendly terms. And Hanau at this point returned to the perfume and soap business because she had to, right? He managed to lose her dowry in a combination of the failed business, bad stock bets, and gambling. But despite all of this, he retained his immense charm. He once described himself as, quote, the kind of man who could sell peanuts to the Pope. Despite his having failed as a husband, and in the process she had lost a huge amount of money, she insisted to her friends that, quote, as a businessman, I never had grounds for doubting his fidelity, end quote. And this was her justification for spending her whole career in business with this admitted swindler.
Okay.
So Bloch was charming and handsome. Hanau was small and unprepossessing. Janet Flanner saw her in court and described her thus, quote, an unusually short, round woman with vulgar virile gestures, a Taurian head, small even features, full rouged lips, sharp almond eyes, and a fulminating vocabulary and voice, both indicative of the crass energy on which she had built her career. So in 1925, Hanau began to trade herself on the stock market. She opened a one-room stock brokerage on a narrow street behind the Opéra Comique in Paris, and she began to publish this Gazette du Franc et des Nations as a trader's tip sheet. And there were two tactics that she used to attract the public and customers. The first was this public persona, right? She had a very sort of matronly haircut. She wore black suits, right? She sort of acted very sober and trustworthy. And the second was a nearly jingoistic patriotism. And this woman had as her motto while she was running her Ponzi scheme, quote, "Honest business is the only business." Now, the 1920s in France were known as the Anne Folie, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, this combination of economic growth and wild cultural innovation, right? We know a lot of the cultural stuff from the Gertrude Stein and the Violette Morris episodes, right? Literature, Dada, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, the Ballet Russe, works by Stravinsky and Poulenc and Miod and Satie. The Left Bank Cafe is full of the writers of the lost generation. Modigliani, Chagall, Picasso, Mondrian, Cocteau, Surrealism, Nightlife, Josephine Baker, Coco Chanel, The New Look, The Little Black Dress, the Garçon or flapper style. And along with that flapper style came a new kind of freedom for at least a certain class of woman, right? A woman who was embedded in a certain social milieu, right? She couldn't vote, but she could smoke, she could drive a car, and maybe she could even flirt with another girl. Economic growth was strong, and the stock market quadrupled in value over the decade. And so popular culture began to really respond to the idea that investments could make you rich and quickly. Hanau set up her business to appeal to middle-class and lower-middle-class French people who wanted to support the French economy and French business, and who were suspicious of the international financial system, which then, as now, is so often a code word for Jews.
Yeah.
And Hanau said, in contrast to these shady international financiers, I'll give you patriotic investments in domestic products. So this ability to get rich quick while also helping the nation rebuild after war.
Okay.
Consumption and personal enrichment could be recast as moral duty. Flanner writes, quote, "The average provincial xenophobic Frenchman swallowed it like a tonic. To appeal to him, she advertised herself as a new broker, loyally supporting the French franc and French investments, in opposition to the well-established brokers, then universally boosting the English pound and American can," end quote. Quoting another article about her on Crime Reads, quote, "She discovered the secret of using patriotism as sucker bait. People who had never thought of investing in the stock market, school teachers, clergymen, retirees, widows, small business owners, entrusted her with their savings," end quote.
It's a very modern sort of process. It kind of makes me think of these like MAGA-themed coffee brands you get.
MAGA-themed coffee, Bitcoin?
Yeah, Bitcoin or even Bush after 9/11 saying the most patriotic thing you can do to help your country is go shopping.
Mm-hmm. Now, France at this time was undergoing a huge demographic shift. Between 1906 and 1931, 2 million people moved from rural life to industrial work, and this led to villages emptying out and concurrently people identifying with tradition and home life, right, in this kind of typical pattern. 1931 was the first year when more French people lived in cities and towns than rurally.
Wow.
And this is a time when discourse is preoccupied with the idea of renewal, and gaps between rural and urban incomes are widening. And I think it's a bitter irony that the Hanau scandal, one which alongside the Stavisky affair inspired a great deal of public anti-Semitism, was probably enabled by a certain degree of public anti-Semitism, or at least certain kinds of nationalist and localist sentiments that rhyme with anti-Semitism. Now, how could anti-Semitism lead people to invest money with a Jewish woman? I think we have to think here about the kind of anti-Semitism that rejects cosmopolitanism and finance capital and prefers homespun, homegrown nativist capitalism, right? It's the socialism of fools, where you identify Jewish wealth and power as the source of evil and inequality. And Hanau was never explicitly anti-Semitic in public. I want to make that clear. But I think it's important to think about what kinds of appeals this appealed to, and how to understand all the ironies of the story. So in her Gazette, she attacked big business and industrialists. She advertised her own businesses as more sort of honest and close to the people. But she was also hiring quite experienced journalists who were close to high-ranking ministers. And these people edited the newspaper. They recruited signed photographs from big political figures to publish in it. And the photographs helped her build credibility with investors. And oh boy, did she take the money in. In her first 3 years of operation, she expanded from her one-room shop behind the Opéra Comique to a headquarters in the Rue de Provence where 450 people worked, and then there were an additional 175 agents who worked all across the country.
Wow, that's a huge staff.
And at this point, she had 60,000 investors.
Wow. Okay.
And in addition to accepting investments in various real estate companies in the stock market, she also accepted bank deposits. And at a time when other banks were paying 1% interest, she paid 8% interest. And she told her audience, all these other banks were cheating you out of your money. You invest with me, and I want to share the wealth with you, and I want to make you rich too.
8% on a bank investment?
8% on a bank deposit.
Wow.
Which you can get 6% now, and that's like unbelievably high interest.
Yeah.
She would publish 2 sets of stock predictions, one in the morning and one in the evening. The evening predictions also contained explanations for what happened during the day. Often they completely contradicted one another. They seem to have been based entirely on her hunches. But at this point, she was managing the equivalent of more than 120 million euros in today's money. Her personal bank account always had at least 500,000 francs, so more than $1 million in today's euros. And despite wearing always the same simple black clothing, she did manage to drop about 4 million euros in today's value on jewelry and furs.
Wow, nice.
And she also paid her ex-husband enough for him to move to a grand estate in Normandy. She lived in a suburban house, and then she also had a flat in the 16th arrondissement. And this is where Flanner's narrative starts to pick up some interest regarding the gay part of our bad gay, sober K. So she writes, quote, Madame Président's official residence remained a suburban villa in the outskirts of Paris. There she lived with a lady's maid so devoted that she later helped her lady escape from prison. For her occasional flings at gay nightlife, Hanau also had a little town flat in the Rue de Varese, decorated with racy mythological scenes. With her favorite friend, Madame Joseph Pollock, exotic-looking offspring of a respectable Parisian jeweler, Martha sometimes rushed overnight in the Hispano, a sports car, to Monte Carlo for a weekend of gambling, end quote.
Sounds like fun, like a lot of fun.
I mean, we'll tell the story of the lady's maid later, but
so glamorous.
I want to reflect on what it meant for a woman living alone to rush off to Monte Carlo for the weekend with her dear female friend. So there's a lightly fictionalized story of Hanau's life, which has a title which works much better in French than in English. The English title is The Lady Banker. And in that film, she's played by the actress Romy Schneider. And in that film, the character, who's renamed Emma Eckhart, has affairs with women and men, and in the prologue is identified as having gone to prison for moral crimes after being caught in bed with another woman. And also in the film, the character is depicted almost as a heroine, like someone who seems to really want her clients, the masses, to have their share of the wealth of capital accumulation. Now, this appears to have been fiction, but the regular affairs with women were true. She was a tomboy, and among her friends in social circuit, her affairs were no secret. And it's possible that Flanner's just deniable winking nod to gay nightlife was a reference to this, right? In the erudite speech of a 1939 New Yorker writer, gay was the kind of word that could mean a lot of things.
Yeah.
The real Marthe Hanau apparently drove to one of the fanciest hotels in Geneva in a Rolls Royce and stayed there in a suite with her girlfriend for the weekend. She owned 3 fancy sports cars, the Hispano, the Rolls, and another one, and she was the kind of woman who worked 15-hour days and very, very quickly, and she operated very much on instinct. So if she decided she liked you, you'd find yourself the beneficiary of almost unmeasurable gifts. You'd get a great job, you'd get a fancy car. She once said, quote, I give an automobile away the way I give a box of candy, end quote. But if she decided that she didn't like you, you could quickly find yourself shut out and unemployed. And the whole thing seemed to work on instinct and hunch and strength of character. One of the main ways that Hanau was able to pull all of this off for the 3 years that it lasted was her connections with the then government of France. So she deployed Bloch to charm various politicians and to host dinners. He had the equivalent of a several thousand euro a week cigar budget to distribute cigars both to prospective clients but also to regulators. But eventually, the banks that she was competing with started asking too many questions. They were mad that their clients were going away and instead investing in Madame 8%, as she was known. And they knew that no one could actually be paying out 8% interest on savings. And so they began to spread doubts through allies in the media about her companies and rumors about cigars and bribes being given to politicians to stop investigations. Now, in 1927, the then Prime Minister of France, Raymond Poincaré, had allowed her to publish his picture in the Gazette, but on December 3rd, 1928, the French cabinet agreed to raid her businesses. Within an hour of the police entering the offices, it was obvious to the investigators that what Hanau was running was not a bank, but a Ponzi scheme.
Can you just explain how a Ponzi scheme works? So she's not making investments in companies.
No. She may have been making some investments in companies, but the majority of what she's doing is attracting new investors and then paying people out with the money that people pay in.
Right.
But the sum total isn't anywhere.
Right.
Now, no bank or financial institution could actually survive everyone demanding all of their money at the same time.
Yeah.
Because they're all leveraged to a certain extent. But she seems to have been somewhere between a complete Ponzi scheme in which the entire business is fictional, right? Like that's the Bernie Madoff model.
Yeah.
Where he just stuck the money in the bank, didn't invest it, spent it, and then never did anything with it, generated false statements.
And it's also familiar probably to a lot of listeners as what's called a pyramid scheme. So also, for example, I don't know, not all companies like this, but there are some, for example, selling cosmetics or something, and they say, you join up and then you just recruit 6 other people to sell these cosmetics as well, and then this is how much money you start to make. But the money that you're making is just the recruitment fees from the other people who've just joined up.
It's slightly different. So a pyramid scheme depends on this sort of pyramid shape of investors and participants, whereas a Ponzi scheme is just one person taking money in and paying people out with the money that they take in.
Right.
So it can go, it's both more and less stable, right? Mm-hmm. As long as things are going well and people don't suddenly want their money, you can keep it going for a long time, right? Like Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme was going for probably more than 40 years.
Yeah.
Because there were always enough people investing that when someone suddenly wanted a huge amount of money,
he had a whole bunch of liquid assets.
He had a whole bunch of liquid assets that could make it happen. And the reason the Madoff scheme fell apart was it was the 2008 financial crash, and people got nervous and started wanting their money, and then there wasn't enough to cover it. But for Hanau, it was a police raid because she was offering 8% interest, which in public, right? As opposed to Madoff, where he was offering 10% returns, but he kept it weirdly quiet. Like you had to know someone in order to invest with Bernie Madoff, and so people weren't talking about it as much.
But of course, to the investor, they see this person who's got a nice house and the cars and seems to be doing really well for themselves. So you think, okay, this is a legit operation.
Well, she was doing very well for herself by taking all this money and spending it on houses and cars and nice stuff. So she was using the classic Ponzi model of paying investors who need to cash out by attracting new investors, and she only had the cash and assets to cover a small portion of what she owed. Investors stormed the offices to beg for their money back. Across France, at least 6 people took their own lives after losing everything. But some of her public remained extremely loyal. She actually got one letter from an investor who offered to add more money to the investment to help her, quote, weather the storm. And Hanau was sitting in jail. She was very frustrated with how long it was taking for the prosecution to build its case, and so she staged a hunger strike. And when they then moved her from a prison to a hospital to be force-fed, she escaped through the window using bed sheets and the assistant of her loyal maid. When she escaped, she went to the post office, mailed a complaint about how long her case was taking to the Justice Ministry, and then turned herself back into prison. It was just a show.
Oh, weird.
And so this created enough of a scandal that she was released on a bail of 200,000 francs, which she raised from former investors who were still loyal.
Wow.
And at this point, she insists that she's going to relaunch her business. And she gives a great quote to the New York Times, quote, "It is nothing at all. I work by American methods, and in the United States, it is no disgrace for a banker or a businessman to go into bankruptcy 3 or 4 times." And so she started a new newspaper, And there she promised that she was going to pay everyone back within 5 years. And she also, in her new newspaper, published leaked documents relating to her own case. But time was not on Marthe Hanau's side. Prosecutors now had access to the records of her businesses, and they started building a careful case to show how she had systematically stolen money. And in 1929, the global stock market began to crash, and the party was over. But when Hanau's trial began in December of 1930, she spent most of the trial defending herself, and actually was quite effective at doing so. She was the only person who could give a convincing accounting of how the whole thing had worked, and she had an extremely good memory and was skillful with math, and so she would correct witnesses and their calculations as they testified, because she could do the maths better than them. She could very quickly find the documents that she needed. She would enter figures into evidence from memory, and then it would actually be there on the paper. And so it was a sort of bravura performance. And she was convicted in March of 1931, but she was sentenced to 2 years of prison and a fine of about 9,000 euros today.
Oh, wow.
So really not very much. I mean, the defense didn't work, but it also sort of did. Like, imagine stealing all of this and only being fined 9,000 and 2 years in jail. So she could have just walked away and served her time and gotten out, but she didn't. She decided that she was going to appeal, and this risked a more severe sentence. She actually was ordered by a higher court to serve an additional year for being, quote, disagreeably aggressive, end quote, and for, quote, seeking to use her court hearings for publicity purposes. And this was citing her publication of secret documents related to her case in her newspapers. But the important thing for her is that while she was on appeal, she could stay out of prison. Now, after her arrest, the fascist organization Action Française called her, quote, an Israelite and a depraved garçon, and painted her as an example of the rotten and morally corrupt French elite.
By garçon, that's referring to this, like, flapper.
Flapper, new woman,
Not boy.
But what it means is boy-girl. But it is flapper, but there is a little bit of a tomboy aspect to it. But in the meantime, the Republic was shaken by an even bigger financial fraud. Fans of mid-century French cinema may have seen the Alain Resnais film Stavisky. I can recommend it because it stars an, as always, extremely hot Jean-Paul Belmondo and has a moody score by potential future bad guy Stephen Sondheim.
Oh, right.
But the Stavisky affair, which ended up dwarfing Hanau's fraud in size, media attention, and political importance, took the themes that we've introduced here to a crescendo and ended up shaking the foundations of the French political system. Scandals, though, I think can't have earth-shaking effect without having preparation or foreground. And so I think we have to see Hanau as a precursor to Stavisky, and to understand the two together as responsible for a crescendo of anti-Semitism, of the distrust of financial systems, and eventually of both left and right-wing populism in 1930s France. Alexandre Stavisky was born in what is today Ukraine. He was a Jew in the so-called Pale of Settlement, that strip where anti-Semitic Russian imperial policy forced Jews to live in the Russian Empire. That's that Ashkenazi strip running through present-day Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, and the place where the Jews murdered in the Holocaust mostly lived. He moved to France as a boy with his parents, and he worked as a singer in nightclubs and at a soup factory, and then he ended up running a gambling joint. And he sold vast quantities of worthless bonds, but his whole empire was leveraged on precious jewels that he held, which were the emeralds of the Empress of Germany. But I have bad news for you, Hugh. They were glass. So he was first arrested and sentenced in 1915, but he was released after the First World War as part of a general amnesty. And despite continually selling false bonds, passing fake checks, and stealing, he kept getting let out and left off by various friends in high places. Evidence would vanish from police stations. Conveniently scheduled surgeries would put off trials. Stavisky had actually been arrested before Hanau, but he got out on bail not once but 19 times on his way to trial. So on December 28th, 1933, the full story of Stavisky was revealed in the French press, and it included the complicity of police officers and many members of the leading Radical Party. And that's a liberal party that in the politics of this time is probably somewhere between the British Liberals and Labour. For a while, the Socialists are playing second fiddle to the Radicals, and then the Popular Front of Léon Blum, which comes next, is when the Socialists and the Communists get together. Mm-hmm. Stavisky, just a few days later, in January of 1934, shot himself in the head in a villa in Chamonix under extremely suspicious circumstances. Was he shot by police in order to keep him silent about the degree to which his scams implicated leading politicians? Was he allowed to kill himself in order to spare himself a trial and imprisonment? The historian Wilfried Knapp writes, quote, "The police searched the chalet in a way which made it easy for him to commit suicide, and in a way which left it open for the right to claim that he had been murdered by the police, or by the police under orders from the premier." End quote. So the media frenzy reached a high pitch. Every day there were new revelations. There were deputies in the Radical Party who had been bought off by the swindler. There were other prominent radical politicians who had been his lawyers. His operation had paid off judges, cops, and newspapers, and it really seemed to implicate all of these different juridical frameworks within the Third Republic. And Stavisky was Jewish, and he had only been naturalized in 1923, and so he was a perfect media spectacle for the right-wing press. Le Petit Parisien called him, quote, "Russian, effeminate, lascivious, seducer, deceiver, insinuating himself everywhere," end quote.
Right.
The Prime Minister, Chotam, refused to appoint a committee of inquiry, and now we're at a point when even younger members of the Radical Party were starting to split off and demand some real investigations. The Prime Minister resigned. He was replaced by Edouard Daladier, and Daladier dismissed the head of the Paris police, Jean Chappé, who was beloved by the right and hated by the socialists. And so Chappé decided to make himself a martyr, and on February 6th, far-right demonstrators attempted to break through the barricades leading to the Chamber of Deputies while it was in session. This is led by far-right forces, including the fascist Action Française and the Croix de Feu, and the riots ended up with 15 people dying and forced the resignation of Daladier. And it seems to have been, like January 6th, in some way an attempt to sort of impose a fascist coup, but one that wasn't particularly well organized from the top. So there was a whole lot of energy there, but
January 6th.
There was a what?
So very January 6th.
Very January 6th. So there was a whole lot of energy there and a whole lot of bad intention, but it seems like no one quite had it together to figure out what to do
with it. Yeah.
And now if you think about what's been going on in the rest of Europe at this time, right, this is not the only time when such coups are taking place. These events and increasing anti-financial and leftist sentiment ended up pushing the French left into action. So 3 days later, there were left-wing riots where 9 people were killed. And then there was a mid-February general strike of trade unions, and this strike was the first place when the communist and the socialist trade union organizations decided that they were going to organize together. They were united by anti-fascism and by their desire to avoid a fascist putsch like the ones that had occurred in Germany and Italy, and this was the uniting of the French left into the Popular Front.
This is what became the Popular Front.
Yeah. So in 1936, they elected Léon Blum prime minister, and he led France until the invasion by Germany and the instantiation of the Vichy regime in 1940. Hanau may have been, as Paul Jankowski argues, a bit of an inspiration for Stavisky. In his book about Stavisky, he describes her, quote, mysterious real estate company with very little capital and her, quote, new ploys to separate citizens from their savings. But if Stavisky's affair had lit the match on French politics, Hanau's story had laid a lot of the kindling and doused it with gas. Both of these figures were also outsiders, Jewish, and in Hanau's case, an example of the kind of new woman who was driving fast cars, wearing short hair, having affairs with other women, and stealing the money of loyal French citizens. That Hanau was smart enough to see the anti-Semitic and conservative sentiments, and actually moderated her public persona to play both on excitement about her own personal wealth and independence, and on a kind of France for the French nationalism that could easily rhyme with anti-Semitism. There's a kind of bitter irony there. As was to be feared, the Court of Appeals actually increased her sentence. So in July of 1934, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison instead of 2. When the Paris police arrived at her home to arrest her, she pulled a gun, not to shoot them, but to shoot herself. But she was subdued. But in prison, one of her loyal associates smuggled her an entire tube of the barbiturate Veronal, and on July 14th, 1935, she swallowed the whole tube and took her own life.
Oh, no.
She left this letter, quote, My weakness was and remains my disarmament, because I haven't been able to hold on to this one modern device. Money, money, money. And I'm nauseated by money, by this money that crushes me. I'm disgusted by earning it, if not impotent. I don't regret in 1928 having thrown them all these millions I could in their way keep, and I don't regret having distributed so much of it to felons and renegades. I'm freeing myself, do you understand? I will suffer no more. I will never suffer again. I write to you however and as you please, either from Sirius or from Lucretius's mountains, and I remain insensitive to tomorrow's interpretations. I want my body cremated by mercenary hands, and the ashes thrown to the four winds.
Wow. Well, I should quite away with words then.
Yeah.
You're listening to Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queer people in history. And we'd just like to take a moment to thank all our supporters over on Patreon.
Yeah, it wouldn't be possible without you, and that's why we now have, for Patreon supporters and Apple Podcast subscribers, a new monthly podcast called Extra Bad Gays, and that's where we have more informal but still informed conversations about hot topics, current issues, current events, current culture, but we do it with that same analysis that makes the show. So this last month, we just talked about this new gay Fire Island nightmare community that they want to build in the Mediterranean. But it ended up becoming a much deeper conversation about the history of gentrification, about gay men's complicity in it, about how it affects queer communities. And that's the kind of analysis you can expect from the show, along with episodes about Diva Down George Santos and our favorite and least favorite gay Christmas movies.
And if you still feel like you haven't had your fill of Bad Gays, why not check out our book, which is available now, Bad Gays: A Homosexual History, in hardback or paperback. And it's also now available in Italian translation and coming soon in Thai and in Spanish.
And that's at badgayspod.com/book. And our Patreon is patreon.com/badgayspod, or click subscribe in Apple Podcasts. Back to the show.
Thanks, Ben. A really fascinating story. And I had no idea about this story until you talked about it. Well, you mentioned there like this sort of maybe this relationship between like a sort of public distrust of her for her Jewishness, but also for being a sort of mannish woman, as they would have said in those days, like the mannish new woman is like a type. How do they think did those things play into each other? Like, was there a common perception, and was there like an idea that sort of the Jewish infiltration of France had a sort of sexual or gender element?
I mean, I think there was, absolutely. And you can see when Stavisky is being described as, Russian, Jewish, effeminate, right? Lascivious. So Hanau's smart, I think, about playing both sides of this, right? I want to make it clear that she's never explicitly anti-Semitic, right? She that would be too weird even for her. But I think it is easy to see how a certain kind of all these other foreign businessmen and all these other sort of big industrialists and capitalists are not out for France. They're part of this kind of global elite. They're what Theresa May would have called citizens of nowhere, right? And I'm for you, the French person, I'm about our country, rebuilding our country after the war, and we'll all make money by making France great together. You can see how that can kind of rhyme, at least, with anti-Semitic sentiment. On the other hand, though, her mannishness and her independence and her public persona as this like glamorous, wealthy woman who's driving around in fast sports cars is also part of her public appeal. Like, so she, in a way, is able to unite what is exciting to people about the kind of transformation and change of the 1920s with appeals to, the kind of simple virtues that made our country great.
Yeah, right. And in the long term, it doesn't play out at all well for her, as these things never do.
No, they don't. I mean, stealing hundreds of millions in a Ponzi scheme usually doesn't end very well, but, especially if you're stupid enough to get caught.
And so, as a sort of consequence of that, what's the relationship as you go further into the 30s between sort of the response to the Popular Front being formed and ideas of anti-Semitism in French culture, which obviously run very deep in a relationship with the Third Republic, right? Because of the Dreyfus affair, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate aftermath politically of this is actually rather good, right? The socialists and communists managed to get their act together and work together, and the person who's elected after these scandals on a kind of great wave of populist sentiment is the Jewish socialist Léon Blum, right? And he remains elected, right? That's the person that France chose to lead it. the Vichy government was never elected.
Right.
What's interesting about that, I think, is it shows how mobile, right, and flexible a lot of these energies are. Because then I absolutely think that during the Vichy years, when the government was seeking to justify public and official anti-Semitism, the Stavisky affair especially, and the complicity of officials in the Third Republic with it, were a sort of constant public drumbeat in terms of reminding people why it was so important that this new regime was taking the steps that it was taking. Right. So both people responded to this. Actually, the French people responded to this. Some French people, fascists, responded to these scandals with far-right political violence. The masses responded to this by voting in a Jewish socialist. And then what brought that to an end was the invasion of France and was the behind-the-scenes machinations of Pétain to make himself head of Vichy France.
Right. And in terms of her relationship with other women, like it's quite interesting that she seemed to feel like relatively free to sort of live that life pretty openly in terms of going on holiday, and was there sort of a strong culture of sort of independent lesbian women within Paris at that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is our third interwar Parisian lesbian on the show, right?
Yeah.
Well, she's not. Again, she was married to a man. I think it's a real relationship. I do not want to commit bisexual erasure. So I think we should leave the bisexual option very much open here. And that's probably where I would land if you made me land somewhere. Although, as with so many people like this, the evidence of the actual affairs and all this stuff, it's a lot of gossip and a lot of hearsay and a lot of, it's difficult to pin some of this stuff down. But this is the third woman that we've spoken about in interwar Paris who's having affairs with other women, right? We had Gertrude Stein and Violette Morris and her. And I think it's clear that there was absolutely some freedom in this place and time for these kinds of things to take place in a kind of semi-open, semi-hidden way, right? Like, on the one hand, yes, she's doing these things relatively openly. On the other hand, it's not like people are out on the street with their phones and it's like, oh, there's famous Marthe Hanau, and wait, who's this person that she's showing up with? Wait, is that a woman? What? Like, it's like within the sort of closed circle of high society, there's actually weirdly a lot more space.
Yeah.
And Paris, as we'll know from our many German and English bad gays of the pre-war and interwar period, was a place where a lot of people went because there was relatively more freedom sexually. So, that's what was going on there, and that's why that's how that was all sort of able to happen a little bit more in public than in some other places.
So, in terms of being good gay, bad not gay, bad not gay, where does she land for you?
Well, she's maybe good because be gay do crimes. No. Bad. Hundreds of millions stolen, people taking their own lives because of the tricks. It's just not good at all. And definitely queer, right? Definitely bisexual or lesbian.
Right. Bad bisexuals, they do exist. No, I think it's important to make clear that, because sometimes with white collar crimes, you don't really see the victims, and our society sort of often doesn't really punish white collar crimes as much as, robbing a bank. And yet the violence that happens to people's lives and the destruction that comes from these sort of financial crimes is massive, and those people often don't get punished very strongly at all, partly because of the class position they come from.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't come from a particularly high-class position, but yes, I mean, 6 people took their own lives because of her, because of the money that she stole.
And so if people want to know more about her, what are some of the sources you used for this episode?
Well, there's not very much. So there's that New Yorker article by Janet Flanner. There's an article on Crime Reads called about Marthe Hanau. And then I found on a French lesbian history blog, using Google Translate, some of the stories about her affairs. And so I'll link that there. And then there's also just a couple of books that set everything up. One by Wilfried Knapp, France, Partial Eclipse, from the Stavisky Riots to the Nazi Conquest by Wilfried Knapp. Stavisky, A Confidence Man in the Republic of Virtue by Paul Jankowski. And La Vie en Bleu, France and the French since 1900 by Rod Kedward.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, you've been listening to Bad Gays. My name's Hugh Lemmy. If you want to find me online, you can subscribe to my newsletter, hugh.substack.com.
And I'm Ben Miller. I am Ben Writes Things on the Internet. And see you later. Bye.
Bye. Bad.
Bad.